Sorry. Okay, thanks. Well, welcome to the third and last of a series of webinar about post-Keynesian economics and developing countries. The aim of these seminars, which we organized together with Eggenberg, Stockhammer, and Pablo Bortz, is to discuss on the dynamic on developing countries and what post-Keynesian economics can contribute to understand that, and also what post-Keynesian economics can learn about the experience of developing countries. In the previous session, we talked about financial dynamic in developing countries, productive structure, and economic development. These seminars are supported by the Post-Keynesian Economic Society, which also gave us impulse in the first steps of the foundation of the Argentinian Post-Keynesian Association. The association objective is to develop a network between economics and other scholars with similar interests, perspectives, and approaches in order to support and disseminate research connected to post-Keynesian. Before starting and introducing the speaker, I would like to make some announcements about next activities. First, we'll have the post-Keynesian economics and macroeconomics modeling that will be held between June 17 to June 24. The Post-Keynesian Economic Society and the Italian Post-Keynesian Network are co-organizing a series of webinars on post-Keynesian economics and macroeconomic modeling. The webinars will cover topics such as agent-based modeling, stock flow consistent modeling, the super multiplier, endogenous money, and macroeconomic policy. We'll write more information in the chat. You can see, well, the participants and the topics. Second, during the first week in August, we'll send an invitation to present paper for our next activity, which will be held during the Julio Libera conference, which will be, we hope, in November, October, Pablo, in Buenos Aires. We hope in person. During the conference, we will formally launch, we hope in person, the Argentinian Post-Keynesian Association. We will have more information in next day, and well, we'll send that information. Well, today we will discuss about post-Keynesian and other heterodox tradition in Latin American. We'll have the presentation of Danielle, Guizzo, and Matías Vernengo. The idea is that presentation will last 20-25 minutes in order to have time for question and discussion. Well, the speakers. Danielle Guizzo is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Bristol in UK. Her research expertise is on history of economic, political economy, and economics education, having published on the history of policy making and economic expertise, the history of heterodox economics, the sociology of economics research, and on educational policy and economics education. Among her publications is a co-authored book with Andrew Meerman and Sebastian Berger entitled What is Heterodox Economics? Conversation with Leading Economists. Danielle is currently the academic officer for the Association of Heterodox Economics, one of the co-founders and steering group members of DECON. And maybe Danielle, you would like to write the blog there, and an affiliate research at the autonomy think tank in the UK. I am happy to introduce her. We met some years ago, and this seminar gave us the opportunity, the second chance to get back in touch. So that means that the association is already fulfilling its objectives. The second speaker, well, I forget to say first that thank you for being here, all the participants and the speakers. Thank you for accept the invitation. Matías Vernengo is a co-editor of Rogue and co-editor-in-chief of the new Belgrade Dictionary of Economics. Matías is full professor in economics at Bucknell University. His research expertise is on macroeconomic, economic development, Latin American economic history, history of economic ideas. His methodological view emphasizes the importance of the history of ideas for development of economic theory, and is based on the surplus approach of the classical political economy and the heterodox followers of Keynes and Kalecki. Matías has written a lot of academic and popular articles, and he has a really interesting blog named, well, you know, Naked Keynesianism. I think Matías is one of the most inspiring economists today. We always learn by listening to him and reading his work. So I won't waste any more time, and let's start the presentation. First, Danielle, if you are able to start, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Florencia. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen first, and then I'm gonna. Okay, can you see the presentation? It's all good? Okay, excellent. Okay, so Florencia, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks also to Pablo, to Maria, to Engelbert for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think my talk will be slightly brief, so I'll try to keep under the 20 minutes as we agreed. And what I want to present today, so I know that the session that we have today is about post-Keynesian traditions in Latin America, and I thought it would be interesting for me to present this project that I'm currently working on, which is on a history of post-Keynesian economics in Brazil. So just to point out that it's not necessarily the history of post-Keynesian economics in Brazil, but it's a history. So it's one of the potential interpretations that we can think about on the trajectory of post-Keynesianism outside the usual UK/US academic fields, right? So what I want to focus on this brief talk is to present some of the main reasons why post-Keynesianism has found such a fertile ground in Brazil. We have so many, let's say, post-Keynesian authors, post-Keynesian intellectuals claiming how Brazil is such a large community for our school of thought, for this approach. So I'd like to explore a little bit on the history of why that was the case, and to think about some of the reasons why this really worked out in the case of Brazil, and why there is so much space there. So this is what I'm going to try to focus on these 20 minutes or so. So what I'm going to cover here is the following. So like I said, this is very much still work in progress, but these are a few ideas that I would like to talk about today. So this is actually part of a larger project that I'm currently working on with Felipe Almeida, Marine de Brites, and Luis de Paula in Brazil, which is to actually look into the history of heterodoxy in Brazil more broadly. But we cannot think about the history of heterodoxy in Brazil without thinking post-Keynesian economics. Brazil has such a large tradition, especially in structuralism and in Marxist economics. But over the past, let's say, 20 to 30 years or so, post-Keynesian economics has become such a prominent school of thought in Brazil. And we don't have a lot of formal literature to explore why that's the case. So this is one of the gaps that we're trying to address in this project. So what I'd like to cover here today is a few things. So first, to think about how we can analyze post-Keynesian economics from the perspective of the history of economic thought. So normally when we think about history of economic thought, we think about the trajectory of economic ideas, so the intellectual history. But what I would like to point out here is how we can also think about the dissemination of these ideas. So how the role of academic communities, the role of certain institutions, how ideas travel, why certain academic communities flourish or not, they're also relevant for us to understand the history of these fields. So I'm going to slightly point out the difference of these two things and then explore how post-Keynesian economics fits within that. Then I want to talk a little bit about the dissemination of post-Keynesian economics. So what do we have so far in the literature when we think about largely the dissemination of post-Keynesian economics within this global north, right? So the Anglo/US and European contexts. Then what we have in terms of evidence for post-Keynesian economics in Brazil. So is this really a history of success or not? And why is this the case? And what I'm going to finish the presentation is to bring a few points. I'm actually going to raise 3 points why this history was a history of success. So why is it a fertile ground for post-Keynesian economics to be able to flourish and to reproduce itself in the context of Brazilian academia? So the main points that I'm going to bring here is the issue of pluralism of ideas, the role of supporting institutions, and the very successful capacity of post-Keynesian economists to, in quotes, to reproduce themselves in economics in Brazil. So when we think about where can we situate post-Keynesian economics in the recent history of economics, I'd like to think about two potential approaches that we can explore this from the perspective of the history of economics. So the first one is well settled. So it's the approach that comes from the intellectual perspective of the history of post-Keynesian economics. So mainly this approach is trying to understand and to formalize or to document the formation and development of theories that they descend from the founding figures of post-Keynesian economics. And this is very well documented. I mean, we have John King's book, we have Sheila Dowell's paper on the connections between post-Keynesian economics and the history of economic thought. We also have the works of Jeff Harcourt on that. So the theories and the ideas and how these theories are being developed with post-Keynesian economics, so largely from 1930s, 1940s until today, this is well established in the history of economics. More recently, what we're seeing is a slight turn in those intellectual approaches. So the recent literature on that intellectual history is focusing more on less known economists, so other economists that had an important role in developing post-Keynesian economics, and which ideas were they developing? So the development of new ideas, I would say even more recently since the 1950s, 1960s until today. And then we have, on the other hand, a more sociological approach to the history of post-Keynesian economics, which is to understand the development and the dissemination of the post-Keynesian academic communities. So when we talk about these academic communities, I mean in the broad sense of it. So it is about ideas, but it's also about networks, journals, so the creation of research, how these post-Keynesians, they interact within themselves, how post-Keynesian economics is passed to new generations. So here the role of education also matters. And when we think about the literature, so what we have so far, this is rather well documented for the case of the global north. So the contexts of the UK, United States, I would say to some extent Australia, and a little bit in continental Europe. So again, John King's book, a paper by Ivo Maas, Fred Lee also talks about that. But what about more recent communities outside this core? So there's still a massive gap when we think about the history of post-Keynesian economics into how post-Keynesian economics has developed in other academic contexts outside this core that comes from the global north. So I know that maybe this question will come up, so I thought I would just rather anticipate this. So what I'm defining here as post-Keynesian economics comes in the broader sense, right? So it's the approach that derives being inspired by Keynes and, in quotes, as Jordan Robinson says, so the true followers of Keynes, right? So Keynes himself, Jordan Robinson, Kalecki, Zrafa Kahn, and Kaldor, and the following generations that come after that. So it can be considered a slightly broader sense of post-Keynesian economics compared to some other economists. And we know that post-Keynesian economics is one of the pioneering groups or schools when we think about the tradition of dissent in economics, potentially alongside original institutional economics. Post-Keynesian is one of the most traditional schools in that sense, because it develops both a critique but also an alternative approach. So it provides a toolbox, it provides new theories, it provides an alternative approach to orthodox or to mainstream economics in that sense. So it is a well-established school of thought in that sense. And when we think about how was this disseminated, then we would have to think about the academic communities where these ideas came together and how it followed afterwards. So when we think about post-Keynesian economics, of course, then we have to think about the role of the University of Cambridge. So Cambridge as being the main center that allowed this initial spread of the post-Keynesian ideas. So that's essentially where virtually all the founding fathers passed through at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Economics. And then we see that there is an expansion of post-Keynesian economics in the late 1960s to the United States. So here we have the main role of Weintraub, Sidney Weintraub, in expanding and bringing those ideas to the United States, then immediately followed by Paul Davidson as his student at the time. So both Weintraub and Davidson have an important role in disseminating also post-Keynesian ideas because they have the founding role of the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. So virtually University of Cambridge as the main center, then this was expanded to the United States. And then we can trace this spread and this dissemination of post-Keynesian economics to Europe, to continental Europe, mainly from the 1980s onwards. And then we have some evidence in the literature about that, especially in Italy, in France, Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, also in Australia. In the case of Australia, mainly deriving from Cambridge. So for instance, the role of Jeff Harcourt there is quite important. A small community also in Japan. And then more recently to Latin America, especially from the 1990s onwards. So because I am taking post-Keynesian economics as this broad sense, we know that also in these academic communities, there is, or in these academic communities, there are slightly different approaches or interpretations of Keynesian, this Keynesian or post-Keynesian approach, right? So coming from Paul Davidson in the United States, we may think about what John King calls a more fundamentalist approach, whereas in other contexts, you might have something that derives, for instance, from a more neo-Kaleckian interpretation. But this is just to really to pinpoint how we see this dissemination going on in other contexts. But we know that outside these main centers, mainly from the global north, post-Keynesian economics still has a largely unwritten formal history. So that is different to say that this history doesn't exist, right? The history is out there, but we just actually need to formalize this and collect this, especially when we think about the recent history of post-Keynesian economics. And again, I emphasize how the sociological approach to this history is so important. And why am I bringing here the case of Brazil? Well, of course, I have a bias on that because this is where I come from and this is the approach that I learned and We know that post-Keynesian economics is so large and so representative in Brazil, but there's not a lot of research to explain why that is the case. So this sparks particular interest, why post-Keynesian economics is so representative. And thinking about the historical reasons why that was the case, we don't have a formal literature on that. So for instance, there's a famous paper by David Dekesh that I bring here, the citation, when he talks about where are these post-Keynesians today, right? So he here talks about that there are no post-Keynesian professors in the department of top ranked universities such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, etc. But he talks about that there are a few post-Keynesians isolated here and there in the case of the United States. He talks a little bit about how post-Keynesians are left or left out of the University of Cambridge today. So they left the University of Cambridge, but are in other institutions. He also mentions the case of France, Italy, Netherlands, and Japan. But he finishes with this point, right? So Brazil is a sizable exception, but it is a developing country with little international weight in academia, especially in the social sciences. So there is a sizable element there for post-Keynesian economics, but what Dekesh says is, well, Brazil is not that much representative when we think about the international insertion of this community or the representativeness of these post-Keynesians outside Brazil. Well, this article has almost 14 years old, so a lot has passed ever since, but still Brazil remains a very representative community, and there is no history about that. So this is what I would like to bring here today, is these points. So the case of post-Keynesian economics in Brazil has a slightly different history. So Brazil has a strong heterodox tradition, has a strong heterodox history, especially in two main approaches, which is structuralism, that derives essentially from Celso Furtado, Maria Conceição Tavares, and the ECLAC school, the CEPAL, and with Marxist economics. However, post-Keynesian economics is slightly different. Why? Because it's much more recent. So unlike structuralism and Marxism, where you see these roots and you see these small communities already flourishing in, let's say, the 1960s, in the case of post-Keynesians, this is much more delayed. So I claim here that post-Keynesians, in the case of Brazil, was initially largely imported. Post-Keynesians, they were unknown until the early 1980s in Brazil. But the reason why they were imported largely remains due to the fact of how Brazilian economics academia has developed. So until the 1970s, virtually you had no strong academic community of economists in Brazil. Largely what you had was some economists that were trained to work in the government, for instance, and then you had, towards the late 1970s, you had this development of an economics academia, but you had to train these lecturers, right? You had to train these new economists, especially training new PhDs. So how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to have to send people abroad to get training in other countries, mainly in the United States and in the UK. So, and that's how post-Keynesian economics was brought to Brazil. So largely through the training of new economics PhDs, going abroad, financed by the government, financed by the Ministry of Education. In the case of post-Keynesian economics, I sometimes try to avoid this idea of the Whiggish history where one individual is responsible for everything. But in the case of post-Keynesian economics, one individual is very representative in that role, which is the role of Fernando Cardim de Carvalho. Why? Because he went abroad. So in 1982, he started his PhD in economics at Rutgers University in New Jersey, supervised by Paul Davidson. So he was the one that got in touch with the post-Keynesian ideas. And then when he returned to Brazil in the late 1980s, I think it's 1986 when he returned, he brought these ideas with him. And he's very representative. So I call him as a post-Keynesian activist, because he was the one that brought these ideas, and he has a central role in disseminating post-Keynesian ideas in Brazil, mainly through three main channels. So first, of course, the role of teaching. So you're going to disseminate these ideas to students in two main courses in his case. So he was teaching mainly macroeconomics and monetary economics at Fluminense Federal University. Then he moved to the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. And Cardim, or Carvalho as he's known outside Brazil, he also taught other courses in other universities, like special courses or special seminars. He was a famous guest at the University of Campinas, where it is a big heterodox center in Brazil, especially for the structuralist and Marxist groups. So Cardim, he was this post-Keynesian activist that was disseminating these ideas. Also in terms of research, why not just for bringing ideas, so importing these ideas that were flourishing in the United States, but also because of his prominent role in international networks and in international publications, especially his publications on the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. And it is quite interesting to see that what Carvalho created as this tradition of how post-Keynesians produce ideas, so the idea of international networks, publishing in international journals, this was also reproduced by other post-Keynesians in Brazil, which you don't see necessarily in other heterodox groups. And the third point that I bring here as his central role, besides teaching and research, is the role of supervisions. So we see how, so Cardim, he had approximately 32 PhD supervisions for students, leading to a very well-established second generation of post-Keynesians, and then we see this is also reproducing into a third generation today. So in that sense, I would present here that post-Keynesians, they have this very successful history of reproducing themselves. So this academic genealogy is well established and it is expanding. But of course, the success of post-Keynesian economics in Brazil is not just the product of one individual being the responsible for all of that. So then I'm just going to finish here with 3 points to present some other reasons why post-Keynesian economics has found this fertile ground in the case of Brazil. So 2 reasons are largely due to, I claim, systemic, so more institutional factors, and 1 more specific to the case of the post-Keynesian community. So the first point, it is about the structure and the conditions that Brazil has for pluralism and tolerance for these ideas to exist. So Brazil's economics education, especially in the undergraduate level, has an active and institutional support for pluralism, and this is established by the Ministry of Education. And there is a large diversity of approaches also at the postgraduate level, so the master's PhD level, and plural or heterodox centers, so postgraduate centers, they have a reputation and they receive substantial public funding. So this allows for heterodox approaches besides post-Keynesian economics to become so prominent. The second point, it is about the effective space for the production of ideas. So non-traditional economics research has prestige. I can expand after on the discussion on the questions why that's the case, but largely one of the reasons why is because international publications matter. Not so much the topic, but international journals. So this allows for also for some space for different non-traditional topics to be able to be researched. And the third point, which is why post-Keynesians are so effective, it is about really the reproduction of ideas. So the role of PhD supervisions for post-Keynesians is very effective when we look into the case of Brazil. So post-Keynesianism is reproducing itself very quickly. So names such as Carvalho, so if we claim that he's the founding father, so he had 32 PhD supervisions. And he supervised many others, like, for instance, Oreiro, who has 69 PhD supervisions, and other names such as Ferrari Filho, Macedo Silva, and David Dekesh have a substantial number. So this allows for the expansion of the post-Keynesian community to be so effective. And then finally, as I said, that this is work in progress. So how can we think about a future and effective mapping of the post-Keynesianism in Brazil? And we can also think about expanding this even to other academic communities in Latin America, which is to think about how these academic communities come together. So thinking about mapping CVs. In the case of Brazil, this is quite accessible to be done because there is a national database of academic CVs for us to access, but also to think about the role of academic genealogy. Like I said, the supervisions is so important for heterodox communities, especially post-Keynesianism, and other elements like the networks, collaborations, the importance of publications, oral histories, and how the teaching of post-Keynesianism is done at undergraduate and postgraduate level. So I know I'm running out of time, Florence, so I'm going to stop here. And thank you very much.
Perfect, Danielle. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Undoubtedly, Brazil is the center of ideas for Latin America and for heterodox ideas, and Brazil has a lot of influence in the rest of Latin America. And when we think in great economists, Latin American economists, we obviously think in Maria Concepcion Tavares, Matías. Well, we talk about a bit about this. Thank you, Matías. If you
Florencia, let me try to. Are you guys? I think see my presentation. I normally don't use this computer, but can you guys see it? Okay. So I first of all, let me thank first Florencia for that incredibly generous introduction, and also to Pablo and to Engelbert for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here talking to all of you. I'm going to essentially talk about something that is very similar from a slightly different perspective of what Danielle was talking about. In part because although I am from Argentina, I was born in Argentina. My family left when I was 6, and I grew up in Brazil. So I was in fact a student of Fernando Cardim at the Federal University of Rio, and my first job was at the Federal University Fluminense. So I was a colleague briefly because he then moved, and he was in my master's committee. So in the committee of my master's. So I'm product of to some extent of the environment that Danielle was describing. And it's in Spanish, so I apologize. I normally do this in reverse. I do speak in Spanish or in Portuguese all through Latin America, and end up having PowerPoints that I presented somewhere else in English. So this is in Spanish because I haven't presented this, and the origin of this paper on Conceição Tavares and heterodox economics, and which I call here beyond vulgar economics. Which I think what we have from the 70s is essentially heterodox economics and vulgar economics dominating the mainstream. It's that it's been published. There is a book on the history of economic ideas in Latin America with chapters on some of the great thinkers, some that have been cited like Celso Furtado, Prebisch, Aníbal Pinto, and so on and so forth. And I'm writing the page. It's edited by Marcelo Rougier and Juan Odicio, and my chapter is on Conceição Tavares. So here's the essentially a presentation on the basis of a preliminary version of the chapter. What I want to do is I'm going to essentially look at, like Danielle, at the history of, in a sense, of the rise of heterodox economics, and I would suggest that Conceição is key. But instead of looking at the institutional development and the connections, if you want, the sociology of the development of post-Keynesian and heterodox economics in Brazil, to try to follow a little bit what are the key ideas. And here I should say there is a post in my blog, in Naked Keynesianism, that discusses my particular view. And I know this is an ongoing debate. Many people have written on this. Danielle, certainly the book cited, she has dealt with that too. So my tendency is to think of heterodox economics. I do agree with Marc Lavoie that we should have a large tent sort of view of heterodox economics, but I at the same time think that what characterizes heterodox economics is essentially two analytical propositions, which they're approached in very different ways by different sort of sub-schools of thought. So post-Keynesians, Raffians, Neo-Kaletskians, Schumpeterians, and whatnot. I, for example, I wouldn't, because of that, I wouldn't put Austrians as heterodox and things like that, which is, on the one hand, a return to certain ideas of classical political economy, the idea that distribution is conflictive, and that requires certain views about long-term prices, about the theory of value. And there are many different ways of closing that sort of squaring that circle, so to speak. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that my view is the only one that it's relevant, and so I'm all for pluralism in that respect. But my point is that's an important part of it. If you don't have that, if you have some sort of marginal sort of view of marginalist view, you are not heterodox. And the second is, of course, that you have demand not just in the short run, you have effective demand in the long run. So you have some story of that. And of course, I have my preferred one, comes from the super multiplier and so on and so forth. But there are many different sort of, versions of this story. So some combination of these two things, that you have distribution as conflictive and you have effective demand in the long run. And I think that Conceição was central in that. And that transition starts before heterodox economics exists globally. So as I say in the paper, Furtado certainly would be considered, and he's certainly one of the founding fathers of Brazilian heterodox thinking. I think I always said that I think that Furtado was less eclectic, more grounded on Marxism or because he had read Caio Prado Jr. and so on and so forth, and say, for example, Prebisch. And that was one of the reasons why, and he was way more influential, even though he never had a significant and relevant position in Brazilian university. But that's one of the reasons why Brazil has a stronger sort of heterodox tradition than say Argentina. Prebisch had a much more, although he did have roles at the University of Buenos Aires and so on and so forth, he had a considerably more eclectic view in these issues, and it was harder for him to build a school or something along those lines. So Conceição is the key author. So she's the one that moves, in particular, in the question of the debate about stagnation in the 1960s, in her debate with her master, with Furtado and Carolina Alves, which she might be here, I don't know, but she pointed me out to the book of letters that was just published that I had bought, but I didn't receive at that point, but I actually got it online so that I could look at it. And she apologizes directly in letters to Furtado for her critiques. But it's in that debate that she moves the idea of effective demand to the long run. And I think that that's one of the important things that she contributed to the development of the heterodoxy and of post-Keynesian economics in Brazil. And the other debate that I'm not sure I'm going to have time, but if I do have time, I think that another thing that it's important and distinctive of I would say Latin American, not just Brazilian heterodox thinking, is that even, you know, this is typical of Marxist economic thinking, not so much of other traditions, but structuralism shares, and that again with classical political economy, a preoccupation of the historical background and an understanding of the geopolitics in which, you know, broadly speaking, of the political economy, the idea of conflict as being central for the understanding of the processes of development. And in that sense, I think that her discussion of the, you know, end or the you know, the return, if you want, of American hegemony in the 1980s was quite central and innovative and different that you know, what you had around. I had a few final reflections which go in the direction of actually what Danielle was talking, which is her institutional role. So she was central in creating some of the seminal graduate programs in Brazil. She participated in the original meeting of that created the postgraduate courses in Brazil in the late 60s, you know, with other people like Mario Henrique Simons and Delfim Neto, and, you know, some of the important conservative authors in Brazil. So the main argument, I suppose I already said, is that she of course comes from the tradition, the structuralist tradition of Eclac, and it's building on that tradition, but she is the key author, I would say, in understanding the development of heterodox ideas and the, you know, the formation of non-heterodox economists in Brazil. So she's it's the sort of, you know, trunk from which all the branches sort of break, and including the ones that are not directly her disciples, like Cardim, who was a disciple of Antonio Barros de Castro, who was, I should say, also my teacher and was a colleague, an undergraduate colleague of Conceição. And Conceição was never my teacher, I should say. She stopped teaching in undergraduate courses in the 80s, and I went to the university, at the Federal University. I am what in Brazil they call the Cruzado generation. So I remember the day, February 28, 1986, where the plan was announced. And she was very prominent later on. You know, she cried on TV defending the plan and so on and so forth. So I started at university in 87. She wasn't teaching by then, and by the time I was in the graduate courses, she had sort of retired. But she was a regular presence, and I should say she's still alive, and she's 91 years old at this point. So the fundamental story here is a story about growth, and so let me sort of go into that. So if you think of the original arguments of Eclac, the original arguments of Eclac are fundamentally associated to the external sector. The preoccupation in the 49 paper by Prebisch, the manifesto, which is presented in Cuba, I should say again, to show the importance of Furtado in all of this. The paper is published officially in 1950 in English and in Spanish by the UN, but it appears first in 1949 in Portuguese, translated by Furtado himself in the Revista Brasileira de Economia, which is the main, mainstream sort of journal to this day, published by the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. So Goudin, who was the head of FGV at that point, a very conservative man, finance minister during a conservative government, after Vargas sort of falls, published the paper. So they were open enough to publish a paper with radical ideas, and those ideas suggest that the problems are associated with the ability to incorporate productivity into higher wages. So the notion of, by the way, of the fall in terms of trade is associated to the bargaining capacity of workers to, in the center, maintain the wages high even in downturns, and the inability of the periphery to do that. And so the reason was of industrialization was to incorporate this mass of workers into the sectors that allow them to have higher living standards, higher wages. And the limitation for growth was, of course, the external constraint. These ideas would build into Calder and I see Carolina is there, so good. I'm glad that you're here, and thank you for the book, the recommendation. But as I was saying, so the external constraint here moves him in the direction, of course, of a demand constraint. It's not particularly a demand growth model, although it can be thought as it's a constraint, but it can be thought as a model that it can be formalized along the lines of a super multiplier. In fact, by the time Thirlwell will formalize some of those ideas later, he does explicitly talk about the super multiplier, and Kaldor is one of the first to talk about that. There's a whole issue there with Kaldor. I won't have time if I get into that of discussing it, but at any rate, Mark Lavoie famously says that there are two Kaldors, the Kaldor Mark I and the Kaldor Mark II. This is sort of the Kaldor Mark II. But Fabio Freitas has done work that shows that at the end of the day, Kaldor still believed in a supply constraint, but that's beyond the scope of this. So certainly Prebisch brings that sort of element. But when you think of a claque in general, they still remain in many ways within you can see this as a paradox as based on classical political economy. They all had read Marx, certainly what was called the Red Division of the claque that was headed by Furtado. That had, the key sort of thinker there is, besides Furtado himself, is Juan Noyola Vázquez, which is the pioneer on inflation theory. And I'm not going to say anything about Conceição and inflation, but she has contributions there, and they are discussed in the paper. But they still think in terms of something that can be thought as being Say's law. So they do think that part of the problem in Latin America is the patterns of consumption of the elites, that there is a surplus that if you read Furtado's classic book written in Cambridge, participating in the seminars there with John Robinson and Sraffa and Kaldor. Kaldor was the key person that took him to Cambridge. He had visited Chile and Mexico. Kaletsky too, I should say, but Kaldor was instrumental in bringing Furtado to Cambridge. And he does speak both of the ideas of the surplus and has a very clear grasp of Keynesian ideas in there. But the notion is still very much an idea in which the patterns of consumption that are imitative, they follow the patterns of consumption of the central countries of the elites in Latin America. They reduce the surplus, they reduce, if you want, profits, and they in that sense limit the ability to promote growth, accumulation. And so there is this sort of classical Say's law, if you want, that it's still part of the thinking within a claque. It is certainly visible, for example, in Prebisch after a claque. So Prebisch at a claque at an UNCTAD, because of the necessity to discuss the problems of the external constraint, he does emphasize the issues of the elasticities of import and exports, of commodities versus manufactured goods, the protectionism of the developed countries, and so on and so forth. After he leaves, Capitalismo Periférico, his last book published in 1981, I think, it's essentially a book that suggests that the problems of growth are internal, they're not external, and they're associated with the elites and their patterns of consumption. So that is very much in there, and you can think of Conceição's first sort of important paper published in '63, as I say there, on import substitution. That was work she did for a claque, and a claque had at that point she worked at the National Development Bank, and she did a course of formation. It wasn't a master's, but it was a postgraduate sort of course. There she was a student of both Osvaldo Sunkel, and although she's the same age as Sunkel, but she had a degree of math from Portugal before she moved to Brazil, so she was slightly older when she went to college in Brazil. And of Aníbal Pinto. And so she always says that her two sort of mentors, in a sense, were Furtado, which was never her teacher, and the other, Aníbal Pinto, the Chilean economist, who was the teacher in this particular course, and that hired her for a claque at that point. This paper fundamentally is the same as all of these sort of papers at a claque, not only it suggests that the problems are associated to the patterns of accumulation of the the patterns of consumption of the elites, but also that the hard part, if you want, of import substitution, which required more capital intensive sort of sectors, or if you want in the Marxist sort of terminology, with higher organic composition of capital, that was part of the reasons for the relative stagnation of the economy at that point. And I'm not going to discuss here the limitations of the idea of the fallen tendency of the rate of profit and whatnot, but some of those have been discredited too. But what's important in this is that Conceição does move away from these notions when she discusses the contribution of Furtado, the 1965 book that I quoted there on the stagnation in Brazil and the and the problems during the mid 60s with the lack of growth that will vanish by the late 60s. They're sort of gone. Furtado has a famous model, also a book on the Brazilian model at that particular point, and so he's also trying to rethink. But Furtado remains very much in the stagnationist camp. You have to remember this is a period in which those sort of ideas were not just in Latin America. So you have Baran and Suisi, you have several other authors thinking along similar lines. And what she says is, so let me again here go a little bit faster. In her paper that was written, with José Serra, who had certainly changed a lot since then, but the point is that effectively, when looked by the time they wrote this paper, the first draft I think is from 1970, but it's published in 1971, and there are several publications of this paper. Is that by then that the Brazilian economy not only grew but grew fast. There is this sort of notion that it's a miracle. Even if you get the book on development by John Robinson, there is a whole section on Brazil and the Brazilian miracle, and so Brazil, if you look at the whole period from 1930 to about 1980, is one of the fastest growing developing countries in the world. So there is no doubt about that. She changes the theoretical sort of analytical framework, and she starts thinking in terms that so she's trying to explain. So it's reality here. She's trying to explain what happened and why Furtado is eventually incorrect. And she, as I told you, writes to Furtado, says, "I'm so sorry. This filial sort of thing. I'm here, telling you that you're wrong." And the reasons are, for stagnation are not, she doesn't look at of course, at the patterns of consumption of the elites. In fact, she does, but it ends up reaching a very different sort of conclusion, which reveals the analytical changes in her way of thinking. So first of all, she says that the reason for the stagnation is, on the one hand, a relative reduction of public investment, a lull there during the period that probably is associated right before the first stages of the military coup in Brazil, which there was a stabilization program, and that the boom is allowed because you have, and here she uses the ideas of her master, of her mentor, of her mentor, Aníbal Pinto, the idea that Brazil had sort of changed the style of development. So Brazil had a new style of development. This new style of development required significant and heavy state investment. This state investment went to the parts that were not necessarily profitable, and so it allowed foreign capital, which was coming heavily at this particular point. So part of the reasons of the coup is associated in part, one might think, to political economy issues and the transnational corporations and whatnot. Certainly the United States had a role in the coup in Brazil and many other places in Latin America. And that it allowed these international corporations to install themselves there, that reduced, socialized the cost of installation and allowed them even to start exporting. And Brazil has a sort of an increase in exports in this particular period. And the other thing is that the actual redistribution of income, which is sort of negative, and Brazil becomes more unequal, significantly so at this point. And I should say she had started her career looking, and I know I'm reaching almost 20 minutes, so I'll try to finish this and then conclude. She had started the study of with income distribution. And what she noted is that the policies done at this point by Bulhões and his sort of assistant Mário Henrique Simonsen is that they're compressing wages, so they're giving wages less than the full inflation, and that reduced wages. But at the same time, this created a significant increase of the salaries of an upper sort of tier of administrative workers, and that those that expansion of consumption allowed the expansion of the economy. So she's thinking in terms of both public investment and some patterns of consumption that can push, so the autonomous parts of demand that can push the process of economic growth. And in that sense, she's starting to think, and she's introducing Kalecki, and Kalecki will be one of the key authors of introducing Kalecki, which she learned at ECLAC and her course with Sunkel and Nibal Pinto and so on and so forth at ECLAC. Kalecki was not read at the federal, at that point was called University of Brazil, but at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And so not only she has now that the external sector is central, but the external, sorry, not the external sector, that autonomous demand is central, but autonomous demand is not just appearing when it's a restriction associated to the external sector. Demand appears now in terms of domestic demand associated to the government spending and parts of consumption that are relatively autonomous from income. Also, she emphasizes in that work the role of finance. And again, finance being central for the autonomous parts of spending. So in that sense, if one defines, as I tend to do, heterodoxy with the role of one of the two things, conflictive distribution and effective demand in the long run, she certainly was the key person in this. I'm going to jump all of this on U.S. hegemony, and I'm more than happy to come back.
Sorry, 5 minutes.
Oh, well, I thought I had 20 minutes, and I see that I have 22. So I'm just going to say a couple. I wouldn't be able to cover it in 3 minutes anyway. So let me conclude and say a couple of things about her overall contributions. I think that Conceição is the key author, because although normally when we think of Brazilian heterodoxy, I suppose I can stop sharing too and at least see some faces. When we think of heterodoxy in Brazil, certainly Furtado is the person that comes to mind, and then the three authors that are often put in the same level are Conceição, Castro, and Lessa. And I was lucky to have two of them as teachers, Castro and Lessa, which are authors of a famous sort of introduction to structuralism and introduction to economics textbook that it's popular in Latin America. But she was slightly older than both Castro and Lessa, and had a very close relation with Lessa, a more complicated relation with Castro. But the three of them founded essentially, they were invited to come by João Manuel Cardoso de Mello and Beluso and others at Campinas to be the key sort of intellectual spine of the first heterodox graduate course in Brazil at Campinas. They all sort of got their PhD, so to speak, but by presenting theses to each other over there. So that's how that sort of started, even before we started sending people to study abroad. I'm one of those people that they sent to study abroad, and then, as Franklin Serrano says, they were lucky. So there are two kinds of problems, brain drain and brain damage. So brain damage is the people that go to study to Chicago and come back And you know, Brazilians were lucky. So I did come back and taught for a while, I should say, at the Federal University of Brazil. But she created, you know, that program that created the sort of institutionally weaker program, but you know, and more plural in many ways program at the Federal University of Rio, where I did my master's. And she, you know, again gave, I think, more than just institutions, which are central, and she gave a direction to heterodox economics in Brazil. And she happened to be there at the moment that the heterodoxy became a thing. So when Campinas is created, they invite, you know, they do a big seminar, and that seminar, it's a published book. They invite Nell, they invite Garagnani, they invite Davidson, they invite Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen didn't go, you know, couldn't go, but at that point he was there. They invite some Neo-Schumpeterians, which have not been cited here, but those were prominent in all my education. She certainly thought more of Schumpeter than I would. But that's another story. So I think that the central thing about Conceição Tavares is that the ideas that she started developing and institutions she created allowed for a very strong and thriving heterodox community in Brazil that was very well described by Danielle about you know, the sociology of how those things sort of took place. Thank you.
Thank you, Matías, for your presentation. Well, let's start with question and comments while you